Welcome to the Trent England Show. I was just sending a message out on Twitter. There we go. Okay. Welcome to the Trent England Show. We're back in the studio, which means I've got my computer in front of me, which is always dangerous, but just pushing out good information to folks out there with questions about what's really going on in Oklahoma schools. I mean, we have had a historic major tax increase, almost $500 million, the package, over $400 million. I guess they cut a little piece of it. But as we pointed out this week, doesn't affect the teacher pay raises at all. The teacher pay raise is historic. The teacher pay raise bumps Oklahoma up. If you don't want to adjust for anything, if you think, and we're going to talk about this a lot more in just a couple minutes on the show, if you think there's no difference between Manhattan and Tahlequah, and you want to compare all of those numbers in what we call nominal dollars, then Oklahoma is jumping up from 47, 48, depending on how you count it, whose data you use, up into the 30s. That's a huge jump in pay, right? Are you getting a $6,000, $7,000 pay raise this year? If you are, congratulations, you're probably a teacher. If you adjust for cost of living, and again, we're going to talk about this a lot in the tail end of the show here, if you adjust for cost of living, Oklahoma teachers are set to be some of the best paid in the country. Up around the latest number, I've seen some numbers that say 11th, I've seen some numbers I think are a little more up to date that say 13th highest paid in the country. So obviously school districts are closed in protest, right? I mean, the legislature just gave in to the OEA demands, passed a historic tax increase, passed a historic pay raise for teachers. So obviously, I mean, that was last week. It makes sense that schools are closed this week, doesn't it? Look, if you want good data about school district finance, we take the state's data at OCPA, we take it and put it on our website in a way that just makes it accessible to you. We do nothing to it except load it into a web platform that you can actually explore. You can look at your school district, or you can look statewide, or you can look at somebody else's school district. Maybe you've seen somebody on the news and you find them particularly annoying. You can go and see what's going on in their school district. How much do they spend per student? How much has it gone up? Has it really gone down? Probably hasn't gone down. It's probably gone up. And you can see how much. OCPAthink.org, if you go to that website, it pops up, it dominates most of the front page of our website. It says Education Data Tool. You click on that and go play around with it. If you find interesting things, let us know. Part of the reason we do that, frankly, is, you know, we're conservatives, we're cheap. We want to outsource people looking through all this data. It's more than any one person or one organization can do. If you look through your school district's information, you find things you say, that doesn't look right, or you find somebody not telling the truth, hey, go to our Facebook page, let me know. That's very helpful. We can help you get the word out. We can help also check your math if you're trying to figure things out that way. We want to be a resource to you. I hope you'll be a resource to me. I hope you use the OCPA data tool at OCPAthink.org. So what's going on at the Capitol? It is day 4 of the fake strike. It's a fake strike because school districts are closed. Nobody's walking off the job. They can't go to the job because the schools are closed. When management shuts down the workplace, it's not a strike. We shouldn't call it a strike. One of the things that's fascinating that's going on, and this gets to something we've been talking about this week. I've got some blowback on this, but I'm right, and the people giving me blowback are just totally wrong. And that is the national agenda playing out here in Oklahoma. And you see this in some of the national news coverage. Maybe you've gotten some of this pushed to you. I know that some of my news apps push these NBC stories, these Washington Post stories, these national news stories, and it's fascinating how few of them actually explain what's really going on here in Oklahoma, but they're not for us. We are, in a way, bystanders to our own politics because they're part of an effort from outside of Oklahoma to drive a narrative that red states are broken. Red states can't pay their bills. We've pointed out here on the Trent England Show before, they never put stories out like this about California. Sometimes you see it in the business press, right? I've shared with you some stories from Bloomberg Business and places like that, Wall Street Journal, that explain that people are leaving California, that the middle class in California is hollowing out. We're actually going to talk about poverty in California in just a minute when we talk about cost of living. You practically have to tune into this show unless you follow Connecticut-based media to find out that Connecticut, one of the highest tax states in the country by some measures, that's from the Tax Foundation, that Connecticut couldn't write a budget last year. Connecticut went into, I mean, you know, it was tough in Oklahoma, but we got it done in time, right? We got it done in the regular legislative session. Connecticut had an ongoing session into the new fiscal year. They couldn't write a budget. They couldn't figure out how to do it. They weren't sure they were going to be able to open the doors of schools in that state, right? You don't get those stories because that doesn't fit the national media narrative. That doesn't fit the storyline that red states are broken. And look, there is no, I'll just remind my conservative friends out there, there is no policy solution to that agenda. There is only a political solution to that agenda, and that is if you're a conservative, you have to lose. So conservatives have to get some backbone here and be willing to stand up to it, not whine and cry when NBC News or PolitiFact or the Washington Post comes and makes fun of the state of Oklahoma. We've got to be willing to push back and even fight back, and that's what we're going to do right now. Okay, so PolitiFact. PolitiFact has a partnership with the Tulsa World, and I have been very friendly lately to the Tulsa World because Andrea Eager at the Tulsa World has written some good stories about education in Oklahoma, much better stories than we've been seeing in the Oklahoman. The Oklahoman's education writer basically is just a stenographer for the OEA, but the Tulsa World has actually written some really good stories. They've done some data work. They've surveyed teachers. I encourage you, you can go back to the Trent England Show Facebook page. You can scroll through some of the posts and find some of those stories. And they really are helpful in showing that, you know, look, a lot of teachers are frustrated about things other than pay. A lot of teachers have left the profession and even gone to lower paying jobs because they're just so frustrated, especially in Tulsa, it looks like, with the administration there. That's what the Tulsa World has reported. But PolitiFact has a partnership with the Tulsa World. That's why they're in Oklahoma. And so I just want to be clear. I'm not criticizing the Tulsa World so much as I'm criticizing PolitiFact. Earlier this year, when was this? They ran this back, I think, in March 7th. It seems like longer ago than that. They ran this, so just about a month ago, they ran a story, Are Oklahoma teachers the lowest paid in the nation? And they evaluated a claim that said that Oklahoma teachers, quote, are the poorest paid teachers in the United States, and they evaluated that claim. Now, that claim is false. Right? Even the NEA doesn't claim that that is true, right? That the only place you can find data that suggests that is true is when you look at data from the federal government that includes private school teachers. Private school teachers, on average, the data on private school teachers is a little bit inexact, but as far as we can tell, private school teachers on average make less than public school teachers in Oklahoma. Are there any private schools closed this week? No? Well, that's interesting. Private school teachers were actually pulling that number down. When you look at data for just public school teachers, Oklahoma was about 47th. Bottom in the nation? No. They claimed that we were the bottom in the nation. That's not true. What did PolitiFact rate that claim as? They rated that claim as mostly true, even though it's completely false. And what did they say? They said, well, it's pretty close. Well, John Greenberg, who is the writer for PolitiFact, who seems to write about Oklahoma, he was actually in Tulsa a couple of weeks ago, and I got to, he was meeting with some people, and they invited me along for the ride. So I got to sit down and meet with John Greenberg, and I pointed out to him the problem, the fundamental problem with this analysis, not just the fact that he evaluated something that is false as being mostly true because it was sort of close, but that nowhere in his analysis does he mention cost of living. And this is a basic point of analysis that you should always include when you look at rankings among the states. I mean, look, if you want to use the unadjusted numbers, fine. If you want to use the adjusted numbers, fine. You should always point out what you're doing. And if you're using unadjusted numbers, and if you're saying, well, Oklahoma, shame on you because you're the 47th state in teacher pay, you should also point out that we are also 47th in a good way. We are 47th. We are the third lowest state when it comes to cost of living, and that, of course, is a good thing. Does it make up for the whole difference in teacher pay? Of course it doesn't. But if you're going to write about things like this, I told John Greenberg this a couple of weeks ago. I said, you've got to mention cost of living. You've got to look at this. And he says to me, well, send me some information on that. I actually wrote a piece on cost of living. It included this in the price tag on OEA's demands. You can see it there on your screen. I assessed the demands of the OEA, and then I threw over the transom at the end. I threw in 3 studies saying, hey, let's put this in even more context. Here are 3 different studies. I didn't do them, but 3 different studies that you can look at that all consider cost of living. We have one of these from an accounting firm, one of these from an education website, one of these from the 1889 Institute. And they all look at cost of living, and they all say that Oklahoma actually did, before the raise, quite a bit better than just, just looking at the nominal dollars would suggest. So what do we get yesterday from PolitiFact? If you take the Tulsa World, you've seen this. It's also up on Oklahoma Watch. They're part of the same cabal, frankly. I love a lot of Oklahoma Watch writers, but institutionally they are of the left. They're funded by the left, and just like PolitiFact, they're going to maintain some of these narratives. And one of the things that they want to maintain is you can't adjust for cost of living, except when you can. I'll tell you when you have to. PolitiFact sometimes says you have to adjust for cost of living. I'll tell you about that in just a minute. So we get this whole piece from John Greenberg at PolitiFact saying things like, let's see, what does he say here? Saying things like, labor and education economists say it's not that simple. And saying things like, the people who study education labor markets raise big issues with using cost of living adjustments this way. Well, I have news for you, John Greenberg. When you go out and you cherry pick a handful, not even a handful, you cherry pick 3 or 4 people who happen to have PhDs. You cherry pick them. You find the ones you want who tell you what you already told me in a meeting, right? He told me all this in a meeting off the top of his head. Then he goes out and finds experts who, lo and behold, they happen to agree with exactly what he had already decided he believed. And then he tells us, he writes it up for the Tulsa World, and he tells us, experts say this, people with PhDs say this. He doesn't say 2 experts say this or 3 experts say this. Experts. John Greenberg at PolitiFact, your logical fallacy is appeal to authority. That is your personal logical fallacy. John Greenberg at PolitiFact. Shame on you. I mean, I thought this was supposed to be about facts. I thought this was supposed to be about being honest. And I mean, this is particularly disgraceful because, well, let me give you 2 data points first of all, and then I'll give you the smoking gun. You know where John Greenberg lives? John Greenberg lives where I used to live, in the Washington, D.C. area, and I found a website that gives us average rents. Average rents for D.C. and average rents for Oklahoma City. Can we take a look at the average rents in John Greenberg's part of the world? The guy who doesn't understand cost of living, who thinks that it's a little too complicated for us to consider. What's the average rent for a studio apartment in Washington, D.C., according to Rent Cafe? Studio apartment per month, $1,656 in Washington, D.C. A 2-bedroom apartment, $2,500 a month. And but I had to start with studios because I used to rent a studio apartment in D.C. and that was 19 years ago. It was a little bit less than this, but I had to pay $200 for a parking space in downtown Washington, D.C. to rent an apartment. What is it? So a studio in D.C., $1,600, 2-bedroom, $2,500. What about Oklahoma City? Let's look at Oklahoma City. Can we do that? Studio apartment, $564 on average per month in Oklahoma City. What about the luxurious 2-bedroom apartment in Oklahoma City? $790. So what are we at? Are we at about a third? Is that where we are? Yeah, we're at about a third. And look, that doesn't capture everything. But housing is the biggest chunk of many people's spending, right? This is a huge difference from coast to coast. And for somebody who claims to be about facts, to say that it's just too complicated for us to think about cost of living differences when we compare between different states is totally disingenuous. But don't take my word for it. Let's look at what PolitiFact had to say 2 days before the Tulsa World runs the story from John Greenberg at PolitiFact saying that cost of living is irrelevant or at least too complicated for people to consider. Here's what PolitiFact said on their own website about California, assessing some claims. These were assessments that PolitiFact had made previously, and they wrote up a synopsis that they put online just a couple of days ago. Poverty in California, they assessed this claim. Does California have the highest poverty rate in the nation when factoring in cost of living? That was the claim. The California Assemblyman made this claim, and they say he got it right when he said California had the country's worst poverty rate after factoring in cost of living expenses. Why? Because experts say the distinction is important. The distinction, cost of living. PolitiFact tells us they're again, you get their shtick, right? You get how totally dishonest, fallacious, embarrassing it is that people like this claim to be journalists. Experts say the distinction, cost of living, is important because factors such as California's huge housing costs affect the poverty rate. PolitiFact rates it true because it considered cost of living. Let's go down on the same page and look at their assessment of a claim about California's gross domestic product. Now, I'm going to make this make sense to you. This is not just random. This isn't even just sort of cherry picking by PolitiFact or being results oriented. It's worse than that. But let me do the one other claim that they posted here. California's gross domestic product, would the trio of West Coast states be the 5th largest economy on the planet if you put California, Oregon, and Washington together? And they say, here, skipping to the end of this assessment, they say this politician's silence on cost of living is significant. As some economists, again, we got some economists, factor that into GDP calculations, we rate this claim, they rate this as only mostly true. Why only mostly true? Because it doesn't consider cost of living. If it had considered cost of living, they would have rated it as fully true. But because it didn't consider cost of living, they only rated it as mostly true. What's going on here? This makes perfect sense. I've seen this all the time. Here is the racket that John Greenberg and PolitiFact and a lot of other folks on the left, here's the racket that they're involved with. If you support bigger government, and I know this because I used to live in California, I used to live in Washington State, I used to live in Washington, D.C., and I used to live in Virginia, now I live in Oklahoma. I've never lived in a state with such a low cost of living. It was a great enticement for me to move my family here. I mean, it really was. It was something that we were told. Oklahoma has a great low cost of living. I was just talking to a friend of mine actually yesterday who said whose son is getting ready to move to the Lawton area, and he said, wow, it is so cheap to live in Oklahoma. What a blessing. Yes, it is. But here's why folks on the left don't want to adjust things for cost of living in low-cost states, but they do adjust things for cost of living in high-cost blue states. And that's because they want government to be bigger. I mean, and look, I'm not saying that's bad. You can believe that's good. You can believe that's bad. I mean, they're still lying, or at least being disingenuous, but the ideology is what it is, right? They want government to be bigger. We understand that. Now, if you go to a low cost of living state, obviously government is going to be smaller. Our economy is smaller. We have a lower cost of living. People tend to make less money, right? And so you're always going to find that in lower cost of living states, people are paid less. And so if they don't adjust for cost of living, they can make basically red states, low cost of living red states, they can make them look bad by not adjusting for cost of living. They can make teachers look even more underpaid than they really were. They're not anymore, but even more underpaid than they really were by not adjusting for cost of living. If you adjust for cost of living, it's harder for them to make their argument that government should get bigger. But when they go to California and you find very large government, you find very well-paid government employees, well, then it's really hard to make the case that government should grow. But if you adjust for cost of living in California, all of a sudden all of those numbers drop back. All of those numbers at least don't look as high as they were before, because when you adjust for cost of living in a high-cost state, all those numbers go down. All those states go down in the rankings. Right? And so this is why if you're part of the big government team, if you're a leftist, you're going to look at California and say, you better use cost of living. It's not honest if you don't use cost of living. And then you go to a state like Oklahoma and you say, don't you use cost of living? That's too complicated for poor John Greenberg at PolitiFact. He has no idea what any of that would mean. And so if anybody uses cost of living, then they're just part of some cabal of people who don't understand that $1 in Manhattan goes as far as $1 in Tahlequah. No, I'm sorry, John. We all know that's not true. We all know what you're trying to do. I don't know. Maybe the Tulsa World will pull the plug on their partnership with Politico, because as I say, I mean, otherwise, I think a lot of their reporting has actually been quite good, and I think they've been out-reporting the Oklahoman on education, at least this year. But anyhow, we're going to be back up at the Capitol tomorrow for the Trent England Show. I've gotten a ton of feedback about the show this week. Obviously, this is the first day we've been in the studio. If you missed the earlier shows this week, we've been up at the Capitol every day talking to teachers, talking to a few students, and just getting kind of a sense of what's going on up there. We're going to try to be inside the Capitol and do the show from inside the Capitol tomorrow. We'll see if that works out. It's obviously been pretty full. It's a little hard to get in, but we will be somewhere up at the Capitol tomorrow talking to people. If you have questions you want to ask, I know I've had people feeding me some questions and some ideas. If you have questions you want me to ask, feel free to shoot me a message. You can do that at the OCPA Facebook page or the Trent England Show Facebook page. As always, we're on iTunes, we're on SoundCloud, we're on YouTube, we're all over the place on Facebook. Find us there, follow us there, subscribe, and thanks for watching.